do today is talk to you about the issues of free speech and intellectual diversity on college campuses. Sort of an initial caveat that I am not a First Amendment scholar. I'm a human development and science professor who is simply sort of interested in these issues, and kind of where this comes from is that as a citizen, as a member of the academy, I see the polarization that is affecting our communities as being one of the major problems that we are encountering today. And what I also see is that there are kind of two emerging lines in how we manage to deal with the extreme political polarization that is happening in our society, and how that's handled in the context of our academic communities. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is to talk about how we think about, conceptualize, manage this concept of free speech, which in and of itself has become politicized, and to think about how this concept of free speech plays out in terms of traditional academic context of academic institutions, its role in the context of the academy, and how do we sort of utilize the principles of free speech to bring communities together rather than to pull communities apart. So the purpose of the presentation, we're going to talk about traditional and newer organizational structures that are going to be around, that are going to protect free speech on university campuses, to talk a little bit about attitudinal changes in the college population that we will be teaching, and the concomitant changes in the attitudes of the professoriate, to describe some of the controversial instances of free speech debates that have occurred over the past couple of years, and then to discuss the implications of this for the academy and to think about strategies moving forward. Okay, so there are two primary perspectives, I would say, in my lens, that are kind of emerging about the principles of free speech and about the limits of speech on college campuses. And the first I would describe as a perspective that basically argues that there are some perspectives, particularly ones that continue the oppression of marginalized groups, that are so problematic that they should not be countenanced on college campuses. That some ideas, if they are supported or utilized within the college campus, that this provides legitimacy to controversial and racist and other types of marginalizing perspectives in the academy. The second is that the best way to establish principles and policies that serve the greatest number of the people in the academy, including marginalized groups, is to ensure full and open discussion of all ideas, even offensive ones. So this idea, as we see here, an example of this sort of perspective with Cornel West and Robert George. So Robert George is probably the most conservative thinker in the American academy today. He's a legal scholar at Princeton. He is a hard rock conservative on every single economic and political issue. Cornel West is, of course, probably one of the most effective voices for progressive voices in the modern academy, particularly voices of critical perspectives on the African American experience. These two guys are very close friends. These two guys are out giving speeches, debating each other fiercely in these sort of community town hall meetings, and their argument is that we can bring people together that are dramatically different, have vigorous and fierce debates about things that are exceptionally important in the lives of our students and the lives of the broader community in which we exist, and yet still come together as fellow citizens, and that we can still come together despite having dramatically different views on nearly everything. So these are sort of the two ideas that I would say are germinating, and that we see branching off, I think, in the academy, and even within just the last couple of years in terms of the ways that the academy has attempted to handle this very challenging issue. So, a couple of organizations that are emphasizing free speech. So even separate from the free speech issue, as you guys go into the professoriate, one of the most important things for you to know is the AAUP. Does anybody know what the AAUP is for the students out there? Yeah, what does the AAUP do, or what does it stand for, or what is its purpose?
It's the American Association of University Professors, and it's union-ish advocacy group.
That's right. I think that's a good way to describe the AAUP. But to broaden it, what the AAUP is going to do is to serve as the protection of the American university. It is going to be the organization that has established the principles of tenure and academic governance, and it's going to be the principles by which most universities at least claim to adhere in terms of their academic governance principles. And the idea of the AUP is to basically provide protection for people to espouse views that are critical of the administration, that are going to be critical of prevailing views. And the AUP has sort of had a long history of protecting faculty who have been criticized by external groups. And particularly like when you look at the McCarthy Red Scare in the 50s, the AUP was sort of instrumental in coming together and helping to protect faculty to push back against this sort of anti-communist rhetoric that was oppressive to the professor in the US. And what we're going to talk about in a second too is that the AUP is basically what has also established tenure. The thing that for many of you that you want to work towards, that the ideal for some of you, sort of the prize at the end of the line, that this golden thing of tenure, which is a protected status of employment throughout the rest of your life to allow people to sort of navigate and manage controversial ideas, has been the brainchild of the AUP and has been protected by the AUP. The AUP has a slightly, unusual organizational status. It has no real effective power within campuses, but where its power comes from is through the power of censure. And that basically universities don't want to be on a censure list from the AUP. So if the AUP is seeing or it feels that an instance of tenure violation has occurred, then what it will do is basically put that university on a censure list. And that university will then have sort of substantial problems in terms of image and substantial problems potentially in hiring faculty in the future. So the AUP works to protect faculty voice, it works to protect government tenure, and it serves as the basis and implements tenure as a mechanism by which controversial ideas can be espoused, discussed, and debated, and it sees tenure as sort of the bedrock of that idea. FIRE is something that basically keeps a list of universities in terms of their establishment of particular free speech principles. FIRE, I would say that the FIRE is probably most closely affiliated with the ACLU, that its primary impetus is lawyers who are experts in First Amendment characteristics and that emphasize the rights of free speech on campuses. And then Heterodox Academy, and what is interesting is these three things kind of all come together, but they're also different sort of in terms of their perspective. And then the Heterodox Academy is going to be a relatively new organization that was started by a social psychologist and business professor out of NYU, which basically argues that we need a greater degree of diversity in our viewpoints on college campuses. That the perspective is kind of that we're overwhelmingly liberal, that our views are probably going to then serve to constrain the processes of inquiry, the processes of teaching, relative to an organization which had more sustained ideological variation. So, academic freedom via the AUP. So a couple of important principles that the AUP puts forth in terms of this. And just to go back briefly, when you start a new faculty position, you will often be sort of recruited by the AUP. The AUP is going to reach out to you, they're going to ask you to join their organization, and there's dues paying element to it, but it is that they're trying to increase the faculty voice of professors on campus. And so that will be a choice that you will want to make when you begin your faculty role. So the idea of academic freedom is that teachers are entitled to full freedom in research and publication of the results. Teachers are entitled to freedom in the classroom in discussing their subject, that they have the freedom to be able to, based on their professional understanding, to be able to engage with topics as they see as academically valid. Then the third part is going to be that when they speak or write as citizens, they should be free of institutional censorship or discipline. The idea is that they will have these rights accorded to them by virtue of being in the professoriate, and the argument is going to be that the professoriate needs this to be able to be effective. Then here is perhaps the boldest stance that the AUP is going to make, but it's basically around the idea of speech. And so this is from the AUP report, and it's going to argue that freedom of so I'll just read this very quickly. To some persons who support speech codes, measures like these, which are basically going to argue that there should be no specific penalties for particular free speech ideas, that freedom of expression requires toleration of ideas that we hate. The underlying principle does not change because the demand is to silence a hateful speaker because it comes from the academy. It says that free speech is not simply an aspect of the educational enterprise to be weighed against other desirable ends. It is the very precondition of the academic enterprise itself. So this is the sort of very strong stance that the AUP takes in terms of thinking about what the limits of free speech should be. And wrapped up with AUP, as I had mentioned, then one of the important components of this is going to be tenure. The whole idea of tenure, and one of the things that you should know probably is that tenure is under attack in America. And so that the shift from tenure and tenure-line faculty and tenured faculty is moving to a professoriate that is going to be largely free of the constraints or the protections of tenure. And so as tenure reduces, that what is going to occur is that academic freedom is probably going to reduce. That when people don't feel free to have this protection from the voices of the powerful sort of sources, and what we see now, of course, is the external media is attacking the academy on many different levels. And when people don't have these protections, that their ability to engage in discourse on challenging ideas and challenging areas is going to be substantially compromised. And that the whole idea of tenure and this process in which you are evaluated for substantial, as they mentioned before, you spend 6 years getting evaluated with this promotion to tenure, is that you are to have a substantial degree of protection to be able to engage in the academic enterprise as you see fit, and to be able to engage and talk with and to speak to controversial and challenging ideas within the academy. And my lens on this is that given this unique job category, which exists nowhere else in the world, or to the same extent that it does for faculty members, that we have a special impetus to be able to try to bring people together and to try to utilize our protections of tenure to be able to advocate for a furthering discussion of ideas between opposing camps. Okay, so if you had to guess, what do you think the percentage of Republicans is on a college campus relative to Democrats?
6%.
10 to 15% are GOP, okay? And okay, 10 to 15% are going to be conservative or Republican. Let's take a look at what we have here. In the last couple of years, that what we are going to see is a change in the ideology of professors. And I guess sort of full disclosure, I am one of the liberal or far left professors. Right? There's probably no position on which the Republican Party speaks to me that I think should be implemented as a rule of policy or practice or law. Yet, this is still, to me, somewhat troubling. That when we see this dramatic change in the composition of the professoriate, particularly as it relates to the reflection of the characteristics of the larger student body in which we are going to be engaging with, and the larger community in which we are going to be expressing ideas of importance. That what we can see is that even in the last 25 years, that professors have always been thought of as far left. They've always been kind of considered the liberal sort of unique outliers, and sort of that's kind of been okay, and that tenure has protected them. But now what we're seeing is a backlash against that in the broader society, and that what we're seeing is that what is also happening is that the representation of liberal professors and the representation of conservative speakers has changed substantially in the last 25 years. So in 1990, about 40% of professors would have self-identified as liberal or far left. And now, in those 25 years, that number has gone to 60%. That this is a 50% increase in the course of 25 years. This is a substantial and dramatic change on a societal trend basis. At the same time, what you see is that the number of moderate professors who identify as moderate or who identify as conservative or far right, and this is from the Washington Post, so it's from a fairly established public policy or attitudinal survey, that the number of moderate professors has gone from 40 to below 30, and that the conservative has gone from around 20 to just over 10. So very good guess, good perspective on. So our professors are certainly getting much more liberal, and they're getting much more liberal relative to the population by which they are going to be teaching. Here is this represented another way. So this is going to be the gap between students and their professors in terms of their ideology. And this percentage, or this number here, represents the difference in terms of the percentage of faculty members and freshmen who call themselves liberal. So this is self-identification in terms of liberalism. And that in 1990, that relative to college freshmen, that there was a gap of 15% between the university professoriate and the students in terms of their overall self-representation of liberal views. And what we've seen during this time is that this gap has grown to nearly 30%. So that this percentage of those who are going to say, of students who are going to say they're liberal relative to faculty members who are going to say that they're liberal, are going to have dramatically increased, nearly doubled this gap between the professoriate and the students of whom we are going to teach. And what is also going to be true is that this is going to be unevenly distributed across departments, and that it's going to be unevenly distributed across the ages of faculty members. So when we look at this table, what is the most conservative department? What are the most conservative departments? So this is going to be, so in this study what they did is they looked at the top 40 universities in the country. And they broke it down by department, and they looked at the party affiliation of the faculty members across different departments. So if we look at this, what is going to be the most conservative departments on college campuses? Or the ones represented here?
Law. Law, economics, I'm assuming business, one form or another.
Yeah. So up here, the most conservative one is going to be economics that's going to come out. And the way that they're representing this is in terms of they're looking at registered Democrats to registered Republicans. And the ratio here of registered Democrats to registered Republicans for economics is 4.5 to 1. So the most conservative ones that they're finding has a 5 to 1 ratio of registered Democrats to registered Republicans. Now, using that ratio, or in history, how many registered Republicans are there? Of all of the faculty members that they were able to identify? Not many. 1.7% of history faculty members in the U.S. are going to register as with the Republican Party. And this gives you a ratio of 34 to 1 of registered Democrats to registered Republicans in history departments. So what we have here is particular, and in my own large field, so my PhD is in psychology, I'm in human development and family science, which reflects psychology to a substantial degree. This number is 17.5 to 17.4 to 1 in terms of Democrats to Republicans. So when we look at this, that some of the areas in which some of the biggest discussions are going to need to happen, the humanities, where I think these issues of how do we represent sort of interhuman relationships is where these areas need to be explored the most, and they're going to be the most liberal. And again, as a liberal, this seems great. Like, this seems like an environment. Like, this is where I want to live and to teach, and where I want to live in a world in which liberal values are espoused. But as an academician, I think that one of the most important things that a college education should do is to afford us, that it should challenge our base assumptions, that it should cause us to fundamentally rethink everything that we think, that everything gets thrown back up in the air and gets reconstructed through the process of argumentation and through the process of research. And that when there is a particular perspective that is in place, again, my perspective, which so it's hard for me to get too upset about it. But I guess I'd put myself in the perspective of how would I feel if I was not a Democrat? If I was not someone that wanted the Democrats to win every election, and I saw this number and the numbers were flipped in terms of a particular set of voter registrations for an institution which is an exceptionally important institution in contemporary society. And that makes me think differently about this. This is represented in a slightly different way. These are the percentage of departments across the United States and college campuses with 0 registered Republicans. So when represented this way, law is the one that is the most likely to have at least one Republican on its campus, on its faculty. But yet, across many, these are the numbers on which there are 0 registered Republicans in terms of departments across the United States. What is also important is that this is becoming more pronounced with mostly your generation. That in terms of this is by professor age. So that when we look at, this D to R ratio is Democrat to Republican ratio. And what you see is over 65 is, again, that what we have is the overwhelmingly Democratic representation, or the overwhelmingly liberal representation, in which there's a 10-to-1 perspective of this population. But for those who are under 36, that this is going to be a figure of 23-to-1 in terms of registered Democrats to registered Republicans. And so basically the younger professoriate now, the people that are largely comprising your generation that is entering the professoriate now, is overwhelmingly liberal, and even more overwhelmingly liberal than the liberal populations of the previous years. So one of the questions, I will put this to you, because one of the questions is basically, why aren't there more conservatives in higher education? Why do you think that there are such a dramatically why do you think there are so dramatically few conservatives in the academy? Yeah.
Okay. Two things come to mind. First, the definition of Republican and Democrat shifted tremendously. You started in 1990 when the Clinton administration came in. Arguably, that was shifted the left to the middle, and the right moved. So that which was considered liberal now was considered moderate 35 years ago. So the question of why there are more conservatives is because you're looking at a tail that's getting smaller. The flip side of that is that in even psychology, which showed 52% Democrat, that still meant there's 48% that were not Democrat or not liberal, and that 30% or whatever that were not Republican, you don't know where they stand. And that's sort of like perhaps the moderate group. Some issues they're going to be more identifiable one way or the other. It's a problem of labeling being a little bit too simple.
Rigid or something.
Yeah.
I think the labeling is also a little bit too simplistic, especially when you think about the fact that I don't see any kind of political science based, and they're notorious for sometimes having people who are more conservative.
They are, yeah.
As well as when you talk about I don't get a sense that there were science-related people taken into account there as well.
Uh-huh.
In which, here at SU, we're inside, we have departments where it's arts and sciences,
Mhm.
and they cannot be further different.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
how does that measure up within the county that you have up there?
Uh-huh. So, right, so I think both of those points are good ones, particularly with the sciences, that sciences aren't represented there, and that's probably one where you're likely to see greater conservative representation. But in terms of these numbers, I guess there are basically two kind of arguments out there. Is it that conservatives don't want to go into academia, or is it that there are liberal viewpoints and kind of liberal ideas that keep conservatives from going into academia? Yeah.
Well, it also is what's our definition of higher ed and academia. There's 3,815 universities that are a member of the Christian Colleges and Universities Consortium, which requires a theological statement of faith.
Uh-huh.
So, if you're only looking at top 40 institutions, maybe they're choosing not to teach at those institutions.
Yeah.
And if we're looking at broader higher ed, that's a lot of universities that conservatives can teach at and be a part of those campuses and cultures. And I just looked at the Council of Christian Colleges and Universities website, and they're proud of the fact that their institutions, that's $60 billion worth of endowment money. So that's, a really great place for conservatives to go, that if you are LGBTQ, or if you're a person of color, or if you don't have the ability to sign those confessions of faith, you can't, work there.
I don't know if they have statements against faculty of color at Christian.
Christian colleges and universities are disproportionately primarily white institutions.
Yeah.
That, for instance, Calvin College in Michigan requires you to go to a Dutch Reformed church. Dutch Reformed churches are super white, and they've had a real problem with retaining faculty of color who want to go to a black church.
Okay.
So it's not a de facto position against faculty of color, it's creating systems of exclusion.
Yeah. Okay. So what you're seeing is two emerging, that there is an academia for Christian conservatives, and then there is an academia kind of separate from conservatives.
Yes and no. They still attend and get PhDs from the institutions. I have a lot of, for instance, Claremont School of Theology is a very progressive, I'm in religious studies.
Yeah.
Claremont School of Theology is a very progressive leftist school that has a really split student body. There, you have students who are very progressive there, and you have students who are extremely conservative. And that is not atypical for schools of theology student bodies. I did my master's at Bright Divinity School at Texas Christian University. And the student body was incredibly split, and it made choruses genuinely awful on more than one occasion.
Yep.
Just in terms of why is there,
Yeah.
why aren't there more conservative? I'll throw this out there. I think the other answers are also totally great, but by the time you get a PhD, you've spent a lot of time practicing and exercising critical thinking skills and broadening your knowledge base in ways that allow you to think in a more sophisticated manner. And I'd like to suggest that it's possible that that situation leads one to identify problematic aspects of one's prior thinking and modify those. So that in fact they get more liberal as they move through those programs because they're using the skills that you need to have to be a college professor.
Good. Okay. Yeah.
I would just like to second that, because that's what I was thinking as well. I'm in psychology, and my first year here I TA'd for Intro to Psychology, and that was also the time in which Trump got elected. So I had a lot of first year students from very different backgrounds who had different opinions about what was going on, and I'm a prejudice and discrimination researcher, so I make sure I emphasize that conversation and make it an open, safe environment as well. And I actually thought that it was nice to have these difficult conversations with the students, coming from both sides, but then also pulling in, like Glenn was saying, some of the social psychological research about person perception and about our childhood history growing up and how that can impact your explicit and implicit attitudes. So I see myself as a liberal person teaching students that are both liberal and conservative, and then as they have grown, they're more comfortable talking about the different issues. So if that's what's happening, that you're more open to other information, yes, I agree there's a disconnect in that if all of our research avenues are being driven by liberal goals, then that could be a problem. But I think that as people in higher education and people who want to be academics, that shouldn't be the case. We should be looking at it from a overarching view. So my research, I'm not biasing my manipulations to find what I want. Everything should be falsifiable.
I think part of it is also what your exemplar is of a conservative or Republican. If it's a member of the Republican House who suggested that water level is rising because rocks are falling into the ocean, you know, then you're looking at a group of people who have rejected the notion of science, and it's not a belief system, it's a trust system. So if you follow the trust system, you're going to come up with a set of criteria. But I don't think the gentleman from wherever he was who suggested that rocks falling into the ocean as a result of is leading to higher tides, I don't think he's emblematic of what a conservative is. I think that's just the extreme, and that's a function of the weird change that took place over the last 3 years in this country politically. It's just, you know, I mean, even going back to the second Bush, it's just much more radical and much further out of the tail than was the case then. I mean, let's face it, you know, we may not have liked the Republican administration of that Bush, but on the other hand, he invested a hell of a lot of money in Africa to combat AIDS, which would not happen under the current Republican administration. So there's a real shift in what we consider conservative. And so if we're thinking about, do we want those people on campus, or do we want people who are on campus in the 70s or 60s? It's a different kind of notion of who's a conservative and who's a Republican.
Gotcha. So those are the two main questions, though. So on the right, they would argue that academia is hostile to conservative views. That's the primary sort of narrative that's emerging relatively recently and strongly, I would say. And the counterpoint is kind of, I think, what Glenn articulated to a extent, but that there's self-selection. Those who are interested in diverse ideas, those who are interested in science, those who are interested in multicultural ideals, like those individuals gravitate towards the academy, that they find solace and rewarding, and that they find that to be a life that they like to enjoy. Some have argued that conservatives care a lot more about money, so that basically they're going to go for that they're going to go outside of academia and make a lot more money, and that liberals are going to be much more likely to want to sort of engage in the principles of higher education. So it's a question, and I have no answers to it, but they are two sort of questions about what the nature of this dynamic change, and again, in a relatively brief amount of time that we've seen in terms of the composition of the college faculty and relative to our student population as well. But our student population, as we're going to see in a second, is also getting more liberal, so that it's both, that both are happening. It's just particularly pronounced with our.
I just have a quick clarification question, if that's okay. So in the beginning of your presentation, you talked about the AAUP and how they serve to protect professors in their speech and not receive the repercussions of speaking in certain ways. And when you first started that, I thought you were going to talk about that in terms of more conservative statements. But after I just want to know if this is correct. Are you saying that this would protect liberal mindsets from from getting the repercussions of teaching students who hold more conservative values, and if they were, is that what is?
Well, in its ideal form, it should protect everyone, that it, regardless of political background, that it should protect liberals and conservatives to speak to controversial issues, to talk about and bring up controversial issues in their classroom, and to do research on issues that are going to be controversial. Like that's, and the argument of the AUP is that that's why we need tenure. Like that's why we have this very unique job category, because what we do in almost all of our disciplines is inherently deal with complicated and controversial issues, and so faculty need that protection that will necessarily, every time you take a stance on a controversial issue, you're upsetting 50% of the population, and so you need that protection from the backlash that will occur either from students or from external stakeholders to a university, from university administration perhaps in particular, that those are the types of things that are going to be needed. So as it was noted, the AUP you can kind of maybe think of as a union, but it's like it espouses ideals of solidarity, of the ideals of due process, of the emphasis of academic governance, and the sort of established criteria for academic governance, and the protection of those who are in the academy through the tenure. So, yeah.
I actually think it's far more conservative than what you're putting out. And I'm not thinking in terms of the GOP versus a Democratic type of party, type of apparatus deal. There's a lot of different fields, as stated beforehand, that are not being represented. And when you consider the two, what was addressed yesterday in keeping up the two cultures of higher education, their impact on academic freedom, that has to come into a major play, especially when you start talking about administrations. And there's something very interesting about what was shown in terms of the places that are the most perhaps conservative, possibly, in which they tend to be on surface the most quantifiable based groups. However, in this, it does not show the quantification. If you get what I'm saying. And the people who are considered to be the more liberal, they come off as if the people who are more involved in critical reflection, quantitative or qualitative, deductive reasoning based areas. I don't necessarily see those people moving up in a higher administration. So what I guess what I'm arguing is that from a top-down approach, depending on what institution you're in, you have this push that's happening in particular ways, even though you may have faculty that may reflect what you're putting up there. Something's not connecting,
Yeah, and I would argue that that's why the AUP is particularly important, is to protect when you have a consumerist-driven model of education to allow faculty of all stripes, particularly liberal faculty, to feel protected in their roles as faculty members. So true or false? I guess don't answer it in your mind. People who don't respect others don't deserve the right of free speech. So think about whether or not you would agree to this or not. Or if you were called up on the phone, because we're going to see poll results in a second of what this is. Would you agree to this statement, yes or no, that people who don't respect others don't deserve the right of free speech? And what we're going to do here is look at the difference between current four-year college students and college graduates. And this is going to be here. So it's this bar, and it probably doesn't come through very well. But what this is going to show is the change in those, and what is important about this sort of comparison is that these are relatively equivalent groups. They are those who have graduated from college and those who are currently enrolled in a college. And that what we see here is that those who are current four-year college students support this principle by a difference of about 10%. So that they basically view that if people are not able to communicate respectful views, then they shouldn't have the right to be able to espouse them. And this is going to be about 45% relative to 35% for. So again, these are students who are currently in the university, and this is students who have graduated from a university, so presumably gone through the same type of socialization process or working through the socialization process. And so I bring this here again for those of you who are going into the future professoriate, that this is a relatively substantial recent change, that the students that you will be teaching feel much more strongly on the side of sort of the first viewpoint that I put up in the beginning, that there are some ideas that shouldn't be countenanced or debated or discussed on the college campus. There's a greater percentage of those currently in modern American universities than there were who have graduated from modern American universities. And this is basically going to be true kind of throughout any of these issues, which is basically the fundamental question of, is the right to free speech absolute, and is the right to free speech and academic freedom absolute in the context of a university? This is an interesting thing because this is a change only from 2016 to 2017, which is going to show that the climate on my campus prevents some people from saying things that they believe because others might find them offensive. And so they're broken down by different colleges, but if you average them, then it was at 55% in 2016, and this number is over 60% in 2017. Again, this is only a year change, so it's a relatively brief period of change during this period of time. And that students are saying that the climate on my campus prevents some people from saying things they believe because others might find them offensive. And you can either see this as a good or a bad thing, that perhaps this is good, that people are checking themselves and they are being more considerate of the ways that their opinions and their ideas and their beliefs and their articulation of those beliefs might negatively impact others in the community in which they are ensconced. Or you can see it in a bad way, that it is that people are not able to sort of freely express themselves and to have the ideas sort of fully debated in the marketplace of ideas in a modern American university. So here are problems. Here would be even a primarily liberal problem with the lack of ideological diversity that I'm going to put forth. So the first is this failure to critically evaluate ideas. That to my argument, and the argument of sort of this viewpoint, is that in order to have your arguments, in order to fully understand something, in order to be able to fully articulate something, you need to be able to convince somebody who is completely different from your perspective. You need to be able to engage with and to not convince just the other people in the room that already agree with you to some relative degree, but what you need to do is to be able to develop the faculties and the capabilities to be able to change the ideas of those who are different from you and who hold different ideas. And what I think the potential lack of ideological diversity, and there's some people put some thoughtful, critical perspectives on perhaps there is not a lack of ideological diversity, but that there's a failure to sort of to really question our fundamental assumptions of what we believe and to really force ourselves to think differently about complex and challenging issues. I think what it also does is that it limits discourse between people with different ideals. That I think that if we're to get out of this idea, this is perhaps just opinion on my level, but that if we were to get out of this horrible degree of polarization in which we exist in contemporary society and contemporary political climate in which we exist, that we need to have more discourse between people. We need to have people talking to each other. We need to have people having open and honest and deep and thoughtful and challenging discussions with each other about complex and challenging topics. And then the last, again from a liberal perspective, which is potentially a problem, is the devaluing of the university. So what we're seeing here, so I don't know if you can see this. This is going to be the change in turn. So this is the percent of, say, colleges and universities have a blank effect on the way things are going in the country. So what is the view of the general population about colleges and universities? And on the left-hand side are Republicans or lean Republicans. On the right-hand side are Democrat, lean Democrat. And this is a change from 2010 to 2017. Again, the political polarization, of course, which has happened over the last couple of years, is going to be particularly and strikingly notable here. But this is a general poll from the Pew Research Center, a nonpartisan poll, which basically shows that Democrats are increasingly thinking that colleges and universities have a positive impact on the way things are going in the country. And this number from 2010 to 2017 went from 65 to 72%. And the negatives decreased from 22 to 19%. Now what is important is that in 2010, Republicans and lean Republicans, even those who perhaps were very different from the ideological underpinnings of many professors at modern universities, that 58% of Republicans or lean Republicans said that colleges and universities have a positive effect on the way that things are going in this country. In 2017, in this period of 7 years, among Republicans and lean Republicans that say that colleges and universities have a positive effect on the way things are going in the country has decreased from 58%, which again used to be almost the same as Democrats, the 58 to 65%. The majority of both Democrats and Republicans, again, perhaps missing many perhaps in the center and the non-registered voters, but in those cases, the numbers were largely equivalent, and they were largely favorable. In both groups of polarized political voters said that universities are a good thing for our country, and that they're doing good things for our country. In 2017, Republicans or leaning Republicans are going to say that only 36% of this, so kind of having, maybe not quite having, but a drop from nearly 60% down to 36% of Republicans. And of course, this inflection is the greatest over the last couple of years. And again, I mean, my life is ensconced in a university, and I think that universities are one of the most important institutions that we have in the country to do so many countless important things. But now, it used to be 7 years ago that wasn't a controversial opinion. That used to be that everybody agreed with that. And now what we have, because of the political polarization in the country, is that conservatives are starting to have a negative view of universities, which is, in my view, a real problem. I don't know who it's a problem with, but it is a substantial problem in the way that we think about the placement of the university in the modern society. What we also see here is that this is going to be a 2017 study, attitudes to professors. Do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of university professors? And this is going to be broken down by liberal, moderate, and conservative individuals. This is a thumb poll. 75% of liberals have a favorable opinion of college professors, and only 7% of liberals have an unfavorable opinion of college professors. So overwhelmingly, those who self-identify as liberal are going to have a favorable view. Same with the moderate. A little bit less, but the same general trend is going to occur. With conservatives, in 2017, based on a phone poll, that 51% of conservatives have an unfavorable opinion of university or college professors, and only 23% of conservatives have a favorable viewpoint. So this is the potential, again, is a substantial problem. That universities, I think, are a public good that are good for everyone. And now people who think differently than I do in political matters don't agree with me on this fundamental basis of the idea that universities are a universal good. And that has implications for the way that universities are going to be managed. This is going to have implications potentially for the sort of the political power of universities, and it is a notable and a substantial issue in my view. So, to talk about recent free speech controversies, and to talk about how some of these institutions have protected them. So, does anybody know the case of Rhonda Girard? What came out with Rhonda Girard recently? Yeah.
Well, basically what the tweet says.
Yeah. So Rhonda Girard, she is a tenured professor at Fresno State University in California. And what is important is that she has tenure, because we're going to contrast this in a second with someone who did not have tenure. And that what Rhonda Girard did as soon as Barbara Bush died, she tweeted out that Barbara Bush was a generous and smart and amazing racist who, along with her husband, raised a war criminal. Fuck out of here with your nice words. So this was at a time when that Barbara Bush had died, and she, of course, was roundly attacked by a lot of people of all types of ideological stripes. But particularly strong external conservative pressures were applied on the university. But she had the protection of tenure and largely walked through it unscathed. And what was sort of notable about Rhonda Girard, which infuriated so many, is that, like, in subsequent tweets, she says, basically, I have tenure, so you can say whatever you want, and I don't care what you think about me. Go ahead, and then she, like, tweeted the president, like, go ahead and tweet at the president of the university, like, whatever you think. Like, I don't care, like, this is my opinion, this is my viewpoint about something, and this is going to be out there. But of course, Fox News lit up, like, all of these sort of conservative outlets were furious, and there was a sort of public outcry against her. But they they went through some sort of pro forma activities, and then she was, ultimately nothing really happened to her. So this is an instance, of course, where it's problematic speech, probably regardless of political ideology. You can certainly, I think everybody could agree that it's uncivil, that it is something that is potentially not the type of discourse we want to be modeling, particularly for our students. But it is her right and her ability to express this as a faculty member.
Whoa, but she expressed it as a private citizen, not
Right,
as a faculty
exactly,
member.
right.
There's a significant difference as to how she identifies herself in her tweets.
That's right. So it wasn't through that she was clear that she didn't, or it was clear that she didn't speak for Fresno State University. It was clear that she was saying this on her own personal Twitter account. The next case is going to be the case of Stephen Saleta. His is going to be a really interesting case that sort of pushes the limits of academic freedom and tenure. And basically the case of Stephen Saleta was that he was a tenured professor at a university, and then the University of Illinois hired him. He's one of the preeminent scholars in Native American studies, and he does this really important work on looking at sort of the intersection of the Native American experience and the experience of Middle Eastern communities in the context of their relations with Israel. But he has very strong feelings about this. So what Stephen Saleta did is he got this better job. The University of Illinois is a great job. And he got this position at the University of Illinois. And he basically resigned from his past job. And he had an agreement that he would get tenure, but he didn't quite have tenure. So he made this transition over the summer. He came to Illinois, and these tweets came out. These are some of the most inflammatory tweets, and you can read them. I'm not going to read them. But they are basically very strong, vociferous attitudes towards Israel, and using very sort of stark language. And what happened is that the University of Illinois decided to revoke his job offer. So they're coming into September. He'd given up tenure at his past institution, and now he is going to be entering into this new institution, which he'd been basically promised tenure, and they just said that all you need to do is go through, I don't know if you know, but with tenure, like at Syracuse, the Board of Trustees, you don't have tenure officially until the Board of Trustees signs off, and they have a meeting. But basically, once it's gone through the provost and the president, that you have tenure. It has never really happened that you don't have it. But this case was different. That he's saying these very stark things. No one had looked at his Twitter account apparently before this, and he goes into the University of Illinois, and they revoked his tenure. They took his tenure away, and they didn't give him his position. He moved to Illinois at that point. It was like August, and he moved to Illinois. And he had begun to prepare for his new position, and then the job offer is revoked. And it was a huge uproar. Like the president, no confidence votes from many of the departments in the University of Illinois campus. The AUP has censured the University of Illinois because of this particular instance. And he just recently won a lawsuit against the University of Illinois for it. But It shows basically, or what I would put to you is that it shows two contrasting perspectives of what happens when you have tenure and you don't have tenure, and that how, as you entering into the professoriate, that we sometimes don't think about what the importance of tenure is and about why it's such a critical piece of what we do. But what I would say to you as burgeoning young faculty members is that tenure is going to be essential, and to think about as you enter in the professoriate, as you begin these service opportunities that you so maybe don't even know a lot about at this point, that what constitutes service activities, what constitutes academic governance, what constitutes your ability to thrive as scholars and to hold controversial and different viewpoints is this basis of tenure. And so don't let it erode, on your watch when you enter into universities. So I guess I will end there. The time's up. I guess any last questions or comments, particular comments, if you have.
Yeah, I got a question. So, on a fundamental, we talked a little bit, and I think this is kind of really relevant to what you're talking about here, the overall cultural rightward tilt, especially in, let's say, the non-advanced degree seeking part of the U.S. population. And obviously, for me, the main, like your true false thing, I'd be very interested, actually, kind of in the results of that, because that's something that I'm not sure, like I have an answer to it, but I can very clearly see the other side of that as well. And it seems like there's, at least on the liberal side, there's this kind of idea that, yes, we espouse open discourse, we need to examine all ideas so that we can then come to some kind of consensus around them and move forward together, and we're going to lift all boats, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And my perception is now, especially since the spectrum is wider, and you've got more people occupying kind of the rightward part of the spectrum ideologically than perhaps was the case in earlier decades, that because the range of viable rather than fringe beliefs is now broader, I think, than it used to be, that you've kind of gotten to the point where that notion of the possibility of doing that has kind of been undercut to an extent, such that you've got people on the left, like your graph when you're talking about undergraduates today with liberal beliefs, are more likely to say that those who do not respect the rights of others should not have speech protection. They lose their right to free speech. And I think that's kind of reflecting this idea that, like, we're just so far apart that, look, we don't need to talk anymore. Like, I know what you think.
I mean, that's my basic. And
I'm inclined to use one of these words that Salida and Gerard use in their tweets about that. And the same thing on the other side. Like, we don't need to talk. There's no point.
Yeah.
And it's more this mentality of, like, who's going to win? Not that we're going to raise all boats.
Right.
So how does that factor into this whole thing about academic freedom at the university?
Well, I mean, I guess my lens is that hopefully that we can use academic freedom to demonstrate civil discourse that is different than tweets. That you can maybe think of educational pedagogy as the antithesis of tweeting. That it is about rich, deep, engaged discussion rather than short, relatively short, I'll say, with sort of perspectives on a particular issue. But that the university, what universities espouse is this ability to engage with all ideas. And that the universities have a particular opportunity to do that. And so to the extent to which we say that we want to support academic freedom, that I think there's a responsibility to take that and to not act like this, but to act in a way that is reaching out to the extent possible in terms of discourse. Not of behavior or policy, I think, but in terms of discourse, of trying to talk to other people who are very different than us, and trying to actively seek to if we're taking it from a science perspective, falsifying our own ideas, that our own ideas will be strengthened by the active process of falsification rather than the active act of confirmation with like-minded peers, and to sort of try to reach out to those who have different opinions from us. So that's what I would say. Yeah, Susima.
I guess like I really struggle with like having to like when we say that we need to like look at all different perspectives and we the marketplace of ideas and consider and reason with all these different ideas. A lot of the things we're hearing recently, people have to defend their humanity. Like people have to defend why it's okay for them to exist. And I don't think that like that's a reasonable thing that we have to like argue. Like I don't think I have to say like I'm human. Like I deserve to be here. I have a right to like like I don't have to like prove my worth or humanity. Like that should just be like accepted.
Yeah. I mean, I don't disagree, but like you're hearing those ideas articulated on college campuses that you
Right, like with the Theta Tau videos or Richard Spencer, coming to like Michigan State University. Luckily student activists and organizers protested, and Richard Spencer like didn't speak at Michigan State University. But like hearing those ideas and like that kind of like white supremacist rhetoric is violent, and it leads to like this history of like genocide and systematic oppression. I think we can move beyond that. Like we can be more radical than that.
Yeah.
And I agree with like this notion that what is considered left today or liberal today has really like shifted towards the right into becoming what was historically moderate. And I think we should push the paradigm back. Like we should engage with those like radical leftist like politics.
That's actually great. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I totally question this whole idea of liberal. And even among people within my own department, African American Studies, in which I'm assuming most people are, I wouldn't even know if they would even call themselves liberal. You know what I'm saying? But they are on the left somewhere, and they're anti-colonial or whatever they are. With all that stated, I remember before Theta Tau, just following up on this as well, we used to have a lot of different, I'm an advisor to about four different student groups. And I remember there was one group in particular my students would always tell me about. They would have Europe within their symbolism and stuff like that. And they always was trying to become approved by the student support services and whatnot, and they would always be like, no, with the thought that the Theta Tau thing that had blown up, this is exactly what would end up happening, and all this stuff with free speech. They would say the same thing about free speech, but yet they were just people attempting to quantify, would put up on web pages and everything else, all this stuff about what's happening at all these other different types of events, and that is very potentially harmful. It don't have to, harm does not just have to be something that is material or physical. It can be something also in terms of words, in which you have some very, very stark fighting words, and sometimes these things that we talk about or take for granted can get turned on themselves. And there's a lot of things where people are protesting, as I've told the school and all throughout. We've been dealing with this all throughout, and I never seen none of these people protest really showing up to none of our events. And I've been on the forefront of a lot of that stuff. And for it just to spark up so spontaneous, again, that's another point of my questioning concerning the conversations that we talk about, because certain groups have a certain fatigue in dealing with these issues versus other groups just spontaneously coming on board, and then they're going to step on and go to their Mayfest and their final exams, and now we got summer.
Yeah. And whether that energy will continue to evolve,
Whether something structurally, actually, effectively is shifting.
Right.
Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah. Okay, so that's it. And I think you're off to lunch now.